Greetings, everyone. So today we'll be talking about movement and migration. And so this process of migration is an evolution, right? So in the beginning, or say towards the beginning, in the 1870s and 1880s, we find that most African Americans were going to the Midwest or the West or even other places in the South to escape the oppressive nature of white supremacy. And so we also even see a Back to Africa movement that begins. I know that more commonly we think of the Back to Africa movement being associated, if you think of it all, being associated with Marcus Garvey. However, this movement, this desire to repatriate, to return to Africa, began long before. And so basically, the notion of the Back to Africa movement is connected to this belief that African Americans will never receive the respect that they deserve in the United States. And so therefore, they need to go elsewhere, return home to the motherland, right? And so you have this concept that emerges out of this that has been termed Black nationalism. And Black nationalism speaks to this concept, this idea that advocates for or supports the unity and political self-determination of Black people, for Black people, by Black people. And oftentimes this exists in the form of a separate Black nation or separate Black space. And so you have people like Martin Delany, who lived from 1812 to 1885, who was an abolitionist. He was also a veteran in the Civil War. He was a physician, and he's arguably one of the first proponents for Black nationalism. You have Delany, who settled in Canada, and then he planned to resettle Black Americans on the continent of Africa. And he was credited with this Pan-Africanist slogan of Africa for the Africans. So this is a slogan that we hear time and time again throughout African American history, and also throughout African world history. You even have people like Joseph Booth in South Africa, who is oddly enough a white man, who was saying Africa for the Africans. You also have folks like Henry McNeill Turner, who lived from 1834 to 1915, to give you guys a little bit of scope, who was the bishop of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he was a politician. And he's also pictured down bottom right, Martin Delany top right. And so he was instrumental in promoting annual conferences in Liberia as well as Sierra Leone, and also in attaining a merger with the Ethiopian Church of South Africa. Now, for those of you who are like, were there a lot of Ethiopians in South Africa? No. Not that I know of anyway. Actually, no, there were not. I know this for a fact. There weren't. But the language of Ethiopian refers to the entirety of the continent of Africa. And so the Ethiopian church movement at this time was a Black nationalist movement that sought to decolonize Azania, which is the decolonial name of South Africa, or the current decolonial name of South Africa. And so you have this political movement that also is tied to a spiritual movement. And that basically, very short and sweet, is the Ethiopian church movement. And so you have people like Henry McNeill Turner, who are in alliance with Black South Africans who are also seeking freedom at the turn of the century. Right? So this whole idea of like a Black global interaction is not new, right? You have Black people in the US, Black people in Brazil, Black people in South Africa, Black people in Ghana, all being influenced by one another and by their movements towards freedom against white supremacy and colonization and enslavement. And so you have Henry McNeill Turner, who also developed the International Migration Society. And it is through the society that he was able to charter 2 ships with a total of more than 500 African Americans who sailed to Liberia in 1895 and 1896. However, many of them returned, complaining about disease and also the country of Liberia's poor economic prospects. And the narrative of Liberia, or even the creation of Liberia, is inherently connected to African Americans, right? So you have Liberia being created as a colony by the United States to remove African Americans who had obtained their freedom prior to the Civil War, right? So you have an organization called the American Colonization Society, which had a large number of white members, right, who did not necessarily want to keep African Americans in the U.S. if they were not slaves. They were not enslaved peoples. And so you also had, African American members as well, who were there for different reasons, right? The reason being to repatriate Africans home, to be in a place where they believe they will be respected, right? So you have in 1877 the Black leaders in South Carolina urging African Americans to migrate to Liberia. And so we see the creation of the Liberian Exodus Joint Stock Steamship Company, which raised more than $6,000 and hired a ship called the Azore. And this ship left Charleston in April of 1878 with 206 migrants. 23 of them died en route. And there was mixed success in this effort. And so we even see in 1890, South Carolinian Democrat Matthew Butler proposing a bill to the U.S. Senate requesting $5 million per year to transport African Americans who volunteered to migrate to Africa. And you guys are like, wow, this white man is so kind out here helping the blacks. But like I said before, many white Democrats and Republicans really didn't have a strong investment in keeping African Americans in the U.S. if they were not enslaved. And a part of this is because of a multitude of things. 1, potential of economic competition. 2, the fear of revolt. Because mind you, you just enslaved these folks for a couple of hundred years, right? And there's fear of backlash. Also, especially prior to 1865, prior to the 13th Amendment, you have many whites who were fearful that free African Americans in an enslaved society would then inspire enslaved African Americans to want to seek their freedom, right? And so in 1890, we still kind of have vestiges of this sentiment, fear of rebellion, fear of economic competition, and also just in true American fashion, if your labor is no longer needed, then we kind of don't need you here. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody, but this is the way that your history has continually played itself out. And so this brings us to talking about free towns that existed in the U.S. And so some of them were called freedom towns, freedmen's towns, all black towns, freedom colonies. But all of these were spaces that were African American municipalities. They spanned more than 25 states. There were black towns in California, Allensworth, right? There were black towns in Texas. There were black towns in Louisiana. There was black towns in Tennessee, in Mississippi, in New York, so on and so on and so on and so forth, right? And even in Canada as well. In Texas alone, you have more than 357 freedom colonies. Many of these freedom towns were created in the 1800s and the 1900s, particularly after the end of enslavement. However, you have the first Black town being created in the US in Spanish Florida. And it was Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, more commonly called Mose or Fort Mose. And this space was actually a buffer between Spanish Florida and British Georgia and South Carolina during the American, or we'll say the beginning of the American settler colonialist era. And so you have enslaved Africans who were able to run away to Florida and obtain their freedom. Florida still had slaves, just so we are clear. However, Florida had beef with the British. So they were like, how can we fuck with the British today? Aha! Okay, y'all, all you enslaved people, if you run away to Spanish territory, we'll let you be free. Why? Because this chips away at the economic infrastructure of the British, right? And so you see African Americans in South Carolina and the Georgia areas running to Fort Mose in order to procure their freedom. So these separate Black towns really were radical options in the 1800s, particularly, I mean, honestly, I think they'd be radical options now too. But in the 1800s, they really spoke to the dispelling of all of the negative beliefs and justifications that had been used to enslave African peoples in the first place, right? And so these townships illustrated that Black people could govern themselves. They illustrated that they could engage in independent enterprise. They illustrated that they could have infrastructures, that they could have institutions like libraries, like schools, that they could function as thriving societies. And so one of the major movements around this Black exodus from the South was the Exoduster movement, right? And so this Exoduster movement began in 1877, and it was the first grassroots movement out of the South, during which between 40,000 to 70,000 formerly enslaved people departed the South and primarily went to Kansas. And so you have Benjamin Pap Singleton, who was seen as the leader of the Exoduster movement. And originally, he encouraged many of his compatriots, many of his followers, to acquire land in Tennessee. However, he found that whites would not sell him good land. So he's like, bump this noise, we're gonna go to Kansas. And they did. And so you have Singleton and his associates founding the Edgefield Real Estate and Homestead Association and directed more than 20,000 migrants to Kansas in just 2 years. In 1879, Exodusters begin to arrive in Nebraska, and within a few years, they spread out to homestead throughout the Great Plains area. And though there were multiple communities that were formed, you often have new settlers being inclined to settle in the more open areas where more land was available to them. And here is a little ad. And it says, all colored people that want to go to Kansas on September 5th, 1877 can do so for $5. We can go to Kansas. This can be an option for us to be able to be safe in community together. And potentially create the lives that we know we deserve. And so you have towns like Nicodemus, Kansas that arose. And Nicodemus, Kansas was one of the most successful of the Black townships in Kansas, really in the Midwest, right? And so Nicodemus was was one of the longest lasting communities devoted to African American settlement. It was founded in 1877 by a white town planner and an African American minister. And it was largely populated by formerly enslaved peoples from Kentucky. Now, don't get me wrong, there were harsh living conditions in Kansas. Also, you had to consider the climate. But after a short time, the settlement grew, right? Had 2 newspapers, 3 general stores, at least 3 churches, a number of small hotels, a school, a literary society, an ice cream parlor. An ice cream parlor, y'all. A bank, a livery, which is like a space for livestock, numerous homes, and more, right? And so thinking about how this society was thriving to the point where it had a literary society. Basically, they're having book club, right? And it's like they're having book club when like literally like 13, 14 years before, they were enslaved, right? This is huge to think about how in just such a short period of time, you have people who are enslaved being able to move to a society, move to and build a society where now they have their own money that they get to put in the bank. They get to eat ice cream on weekends or whenever. I don't know when the ice cream I don't know what their hours were, right? But they get to have ice cream now and talk about whatever books they read, which means they're literate. And they get to worship their God in peace. And they get to have newspapers. And so at its peak in 1880, you have the population of Nicodemus being around 600 people. Oklahoma was a commonplace for African Americans to establish Black towns and communities. There were dozens of these communities, and many African Americans wanted to establish societies on their own terms, live on their own terms, right? And so you have people like Edward P. McCabe, who is pictured on the right-hand side, who actually was from the North. He was from Troy, New York, which is like upstate New York, near Albany. And you have McCabe deciding that he wanted to check out what was happening in Kansas, right? So he goes to Kansas, winds up in Nicodemus, becoming a clerk, and then also becoming later on one of the few African American officials in the post-Reconstruction era. He also was one of the 3 co-founders of Langston City, which is where Langston University, which is a historically Black college that still exists to this day, was later created. And you have McCabe, who saw how successful Black townships were in Oklahoma, and he envisioned that potentially this could be so large, these settlements, that if we wanted to, maybe one day we could have a Black governed state in Oklahoma. So we see this concept of Black nationalism, right, afoot in McCabe's intentions and understandings of Black space, place, and belonging. All right, and I'm going to pause this here, and I hope you take care.